A very good morning to all of you in the Asian region, and good evening to participants from Northern America. And I'm very glad to have this meeting on complex challenges in an urban world. This is the second of the open forum meetings held this month. The issue, which would be discussed very shortly by Dr. Hussain, should be quite simple. We are breaking the borders of our discussion in the urban world. Say, for example, what is the difference between crime, violence, and war? Now, of course, scholars study war, but not violence. Some scholars study crime, but not war. But the actual distinction between the three categories are quite, well, volatile and murky in reality. And to address the issue, we have to concentrate on a continuum of a very large world that includes crime and conflict and violence and war. And that is especially an important issue when we observe the urban space, as should be pretty obvious with the large movement of people in the world. We do see the urban space in a very different manner than it used to be, where the perpetrators of violence may be the state, and it could be informal political power holders. It could be many actors. To work on this, we have to ask the participation of scholars who have the courage to cross disciplinary boundaries and address common issues that should be discussed together. And to this, I very much thank Dr. Hussain, who started this work. Today's speakers, we have an all-stars game, really. The first speaker would be Professor Louise Shelley of George Mason University, who is director of Terrorism and Transnational Crime and Corruption Center, a well-recognized scholar. In the field, Dr. Shelley is also one who is not afraid of transcending disciplinary boundaries. I very much thank you, Professor Shelley, for joining our meeting. And our next speaker would be Professor Kazuya Nakamizo, Nakamizo Sensei of Kyoto University. Nakamizo Sensei, Professor Nakamizo has been working on violence and democracy. And in his doctoral dissertation, which has also been published in English, in both languages, English and Japanese, he has worked on the intensification of cultural politics and violence that shook India in a turbulent years. The third speaker would be Professor Yue Zhang. It's close to Zhang, isn't it? It's not Zhang. Professor Yue Zhang, who teaches at the University of Illinois, Chicago, who has worked on the movement of people and political order. On her work, The Fragmented Politics of Urban Preservation, Beijing, Chicago, and Paris is something that only you could have written. Who could have combined Beijing, Chicago, and Paris to understand the politics of the urban space? Wonderful. Thank you for joining us, Professor Chan. And our final speaker would be Professor Chiharu Takenaka. Takenaka Sensei of Rikyo University, who has worked on, well, many things that are, well, related to South Asia, but in a much broader sense. Professor Takanaka has published on the bandit history of India, with a story about Puran Devi, one of the most colorful characters, and at the same time has worked on international politics and current affairs in the Indian subcontinent, if not on a larger space. And I thank Professor Takanaka for joining us today. 今、日本語で簡単に繰り返します。本日のミーティング、Complex Challenges in an Urban World、都市を対象として、様々な視点から検討するという会合でございます。で、都市研究様々な形でもちろん存在するわけですが、新しい意味が今与えられています。例えば、紛争というときに、私たちは犯罪のことを言っているのか、戦争のことを言っているのか、この2つ同じもんだろうか、違うもんだろうか。実は現実としてはつながっているものを私たちは区別して考えてきました。で、これを統括的に考える必要が生まれてきます。で、特に人の移動、しかも都市への国境を越えた、あるいは国内の移動が盛んになり、都市が新たな空間としての意味を生み出している時期に、この都市空間における権力の在り方について考える意味は大きいと言わなければいけません。国家による暴力もあれば、国家ではない主体による暴力もある。非公式の権力もあれば、公式の権力もある。で、これを考えていくことが本日の課題です。で、最初のスピーカーは、ジョージ・メイソン大学のルイーズ・シェリー先生。シェリー先生は、犯罪、テロリズム、腐敗を研究するジョージ・メイソン大学のセンターの創立者であり、所長でいらっしゃいます。次のスピーカーが中溝和也先生。京都大学の中溝先生です。で、暴力と民主主義という、広く読まれ、そして英語でも交換された著書によって知られる先生ですけれども、暴力と民主政治、まさにその関わりがインド政治を揺さぶってきたわけですが、その過程を最近お書きになりましたデモクラシー&ビジランティズムという論文に至るまでフォローしてこられました。次に、ユエ・ジャン先生。イリノイ大学シカゴ校の先生です。ジャン先生は、人の移動、移民を中心としたその流れがですね、都市の政治をどのように変えてきたのかということを研究してこられました。司書が博士論文を元にしたThe Fragmented Politics of Urban Preservation, Beijing, Chicago and Paris です。で、そして本日最後のスピーカーが竹中千春先生、立教大学工学部の先生でして、国際政治と南アジア政治、両方とも勉強していらっしゃる、研究し、発表してこられました。で、そしてその竹中先生の業績の中で先ほど英文で紹介しなかったすべきだったものがガンジーの評伝ですね。岩波新書からガンジーの評伝として刊行されております。以上、皆様、本日のミーティングよろしくお願いいたします。で、申し遅れましたが、私は藤原喜一と申します。未来ビジョン研究センターの所長を務めて、センター長を務めております。で、そして言ってみれば、フセイン先生がこのグループを組織するサポート役をしてきたというのが、実態でございます。Okay, so I'd like to ask Dr. Hussain for setting the agenda for today. Hussain Sensei, you're on.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Fujiwara. People can see my screen. Okay, so today we are here broaching a research agenda which could have only been established here at the Institute of Future Initiatives at the University of Tokyo, because it is here that we have had the space to experiment with methodological divergence and bring together different voices. So with that in mind, let me just begin my brief presentation because I know we have speakers from other parts of the world. The simple point that we are trying to make is that the world is increasingly becoming urban and that complex stresses are unfolding in an urban world. What I mean by complex is that different kinds of stresses are converging together and we do not know what is causing what. And so because our systems are tightly coupled, we have natural and social systems deeply coupled, and then we're highly interconnected. The local is no longer the local. These effects traverse like a ripple. So let me just briefly take you to see climate change. Climate change does not see borders, but you see that in regions of concern, in the Middle East, in Africa, in South Asia, in Latin America, as well as in North America, we see that climate change is unfolding and it is causing a lot of stresses. Sorry, let me just go back to my slide. And then we see one of the stresses as the water stresses. By water stresses, I mean cities experiencing water depletion. And we see also all of this happening all over the world, in the North and the South, but also especially in the South. And these are places of concern, hotspots of instability. Then we see migration and refugee flow. We see asylum seekers. In 2017, the UN estimates foretold that this was unprecedented movement of people across borders, within borders, and we don't know what caused what again. And then lastly, this is from the World Economic Forum, a very recent image where you see a lot of people moving to cities, and you see that it's happening in Toronto, Chicago, but it's also happening, more importantly, in the global South. I say more importantly, not because the concerns of the global North are not important, but because these are the places which do not have effective policing to begin with. They do not have effective solutions or the resources. And you see it happening in Dhaka, you see it in Mumbai, you see it in Cape Town, in Buenos Aires, in Lahore in Pakistan. And so we see that we usually get images of the Syrian refugees or the people coming from Latin America because the media in the West has a strong, a strong hold. But we should also see that this is happening all over the world, not just in the global North. And so this is really a diagrammatic representation. Like I said, we don't know what caused what. Is climate contributing to migrants and refugees, or is it conflict? Is depleting resources such as water, is it because of climate or mismanagement or increasing populations? And then last year we had a pandemic, which is still ongoing and which has held hostage basically much of life. All this to say it is happening in an increasingly urban world. More and more people are moving to cities. And so the focus of our project is not just the global South, but the global North. But I will emphasize that in the global South, generally, that's where instability travels and does not stay localized. So usually when you think of cities in the global South, you think of places which are not, where the state is not a strong actor. But there's a lot of scholarship, especially by urban geographers, which first they point out that cities are not just discrete territorial units. They're not just geographical points. It's not just about the local economic systems, and the local is not just distinct from the global. In fact, urban spaces are connected with transnational networks of ideas, money, people, cultural influences, financial institution, and so forth. Our first speaker, Professor Shelley, has done immense work on mapping the transnational networks. So that exactly plays into what I'm trying to say here, that cities are not just, boxes. They are highly dynamic, interconnected places. And that is where a lot of contestation is going on. So in that sense, there's a great bunch of scholarship by political scientists, by anthropologists, by criminologists, who tell us that all over the world, really, violence or seeming absence of state is not just the failure of state. It is where people are either competing or collaborating with the state. There's urban informality, where state may criminalize certain activities, but legalize others. There's politics of the grassroots. Ordinary people are trying to survive in difficult circumstances. They're not just passive entities. So we have to really open the black box of what is happening in these places of dynamism, and not just see them as discrete territorial units, as unitary actors. We have to see them as places of a lot of change. We have to keep a relational approach, if you will. And so now this picture will make more sense. You see individual level responses, you see group level responses, you see responses by governments. So different processes are at play. And then you see, these complex processes on their own interacting with what is already going on here. So in that sense, how do we make sense of how are climate-related risks, for instance, unfolding in a particular urban space? Or how is the pandemic interacting with climate-related risks and the pre-existing complexity? So just bringing it home, because I realize I've exceeded my time, that this is not just the problem for the developing world, not only because instability will not remain localized, but also because it's happening in the global north. And that the effects may result in social and political instability. So we need to keep in mind, first, we understand what is happening. And then in terms of prioritizing in places which do not have adequate resources and where governance was lacking, to put it mildly, to begin with, what may happen and how may that instability travel. So the research agenda we're trying to put here is that we explore the coming together of stresses with ground realities in urban spaces. We see, are these together contributing to inequality and oppression of already marginalized populations? These are not just poor people who may end up as criminals or terrorists. These are ordinary people living in very difficult circumstances who are at the forefronts of facing these challenges. So they have very little to begin with. How may they be oppressed by governments, and how will they cope? And will subversive actors step in to take advantage? Lastly, that we're not saying that we will overcome as human resilience, that narrative goes, or that we only have dystopic futures. But we will say that unless we have more understanding, we cannot map multiple urban futures. That's in our hands. So with that intervention, I will now invite Professor Louise Shelley to begin her presentation.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me, and it's such an honor to be with you and to be sharing and participating in this wonderful project of yours. I have been looking at the issue of crime in urban areas for a very long time, and not just looking at it in the last 30 or so years or more that I've been looking at this phenomenon, but also trying to understand how it has evolved throughout history. And what I can say is that there is no continent in the world in which there has not been some part of the continent, some urban environment that has been throughout recent history a center of crime. So that crime and large urban areas, and particularly port areas, go together. So if you think about some of the key nodes of operation of transnational crime, you have Vladivostok in Russia that has been involved in illicit fishing trade, illicit timber trade, Karachi in Pakistan involved in drug smuggling, the same for Marseille in France and Naples in Italy, and Rotterdam in the Netherlands, which is probably the largest port in Europe, Cape Town in South Africa, New York City in the US, Odessa in Ukraine, and Buenos Aires in Argentina. So all of these cities are ones with vibrant criminal cultures. And some of them have been immortalized in literature, in film, in Odessa. There was a great writer named Isaac Babel who wrote a century ago about the criminal subculture of this great port city on the Black Sea. There is one of the great classic American movies of On the Waterfront, in which you see the workmen being pressured to work and load goods off the ports, off the boats in the ports. And the unions that control the workers have always been controlled by organized crime. As I've said, the centrality of ports is not something of the last 100 years. If you go back and read about the history of the British Empire and the export of opium to China during the Opium Wars, Karachi was one of the key hubs used by the British as a port to load the opium and transport it. So these locales have histories that are long and well developed. So why are urban centers associated with organized crime? As Dr. Hussain mentioned, there is rural to urban migration. And this has gone on especially since the dawn of the Industrial Revolution. And often the settlers from the rural areas arrive in urban areas where there is not adequate housing, shelter, water, or employment to absorb those who have arrived. And therefore, a shadow economy that is conducive to illicit activity arrives as people need to survive in what is a difficult environment for them. Dr. Hussain also mentioned the issue of migration. And for those of you who know about the mafia in the United States, that has been the subject not only of research, but many movies such as The Godfather, you will know that with this international migration from Sicily to the United States, along came the mafia. Not all of them were part of it, but part of the criminal activity was transported along with the subculture of the mafia. And sometimes governments deliberately expel criminals, empty their prisons, and then send them abroad. So in the United States, we had a very large migration at one point from Cuba to Miami, and it was called the Mariel Boat People. And part of this migration, Castro emptied his prisons and allowed some of the criminals to leave. These were not political criminals, but ordinary criminals. And then in the Soviet era, in the 1970s, Soviet immigrants with criminal records were allowed to leave and settled in New York and the Los Angeles area. And there were certain urban areas that have long been associated with a criminal class and associated with lower class life. In France, this was referred to as the classe dangereuse, the dangerous class, and it was a way of stigmatizing the working class. And here's a picture of a book that's a classic of French social science and history, discussing the problems of criminality of these poor urban residents. Now, let me give you a sweep of some of the problems of urban criminality today and in the last few decades on different continents. So let's start off with the Americas, as I live in North America, but we also need to look at what is going on in South America. In Latin America, Sao Paulo and Rio de Janeiro in Brazil have major economic and political actors that are often incarcerated but continue to operate from the prisons. In 2006, the crime group PCC launched an assault on Sao Paulo that shut down the city for several days, and many people died during this criminal attack that bore the many attributes of a terrorist attack on the major financial center of Brazil. Medellin and Cali in Colombia are closely associated with drug cartels known as the Medellin cartel or the Cali cartel that had vast criminal businesses. And some of the money from this trade was laundered in Bogota real estate. Major American cities in the US and Canada have serious organized crime problems for a century. New York, Boston, Chicago, to name a few. And we're going to have a speaker who lives in Chicago. And you've probably heard the name of Al Capone, who rose to prominence during the Prohibition era almost 100 years ago. And Toronto in Canada has a history of serious organized crime problems. In the United States, the popular tourist destination Las Vegas, with its gambling casinos, was constructed with criminal money, and the casinos were key centers of profit and money laundering. Locales have evolved in Canada. Now it's Vancouver on the west coast of Canada that has become a key center of money laundering, now being investigated by the Cullen Commission. And Latin American gangs such as the MS-13 have been identified in major urban and suburban areas in the United States, on the West Coast, on southern border cities, and the Northeast, including the Washington area. I should say this photo in the slide shows the violence and destruction that accompanied this criminal attack on Sao Paulo in 2006. Now let's turn to Europe. We always think about organized crime and the mafia. But the mafia was not an urban phenomenon. It was based in rural areas, but eventually there was also rural to urban migration. And Palermo, the largest city in Naples, the largest city in Italy, is a hub of La Cosa Nostra, which is another word for the mafia. And Naples, Italy is the center of the Camorra, a major urban crime group, and it is also a key Italian port. Netherlands, in its port cities of Rotterdam and its major city of Amsterdam, are centers according to official Dutch reports. Already 30 years ago, when they started writing about organized crime, they identified over 100 international crime groups operating in the Netherlands, primarily in its cities. And organized crime groups from the Balkans, an area that has been marked by conflict, are very present in many cities in Western Europe. In Africa, Cape Town in South Africa is presently a major center of transnational crime, where structured crime groups are involved in drugs, arms smuggling, people smuggling, and environmental produce trafficking. And here you can see a chart of how rhino horns, that are a very valuable commodity, and the illicit trade of rhino is leaving from major urban hubs. Nairobi in Kenya and Lagos in Nigeria are centers of powerful crime groups involved in drug trade and global financial crime and online fraud. There's a very good study on Nairobi's criminal activity that has been identified or called termites at work, because they have such a destructive influence on the political and the social economy. And as you can see, funds and commodities generated from natural resource crime move through ports and airports of major cities. In Asia, as I mentioned, Karachi is a transport center for drugs and other illicit commodities, but as Dr. Hussain has written, it is a locale where water mafias and many crime/terrorist groups, because they are hybrid identities, are part of the power struggle of the society. Mumbai is a central hub of Indian organized crime with particular links to Bollywood. Hong Kong is an important transit center for illicit goods, drugs, wildlife, and counterfeit goods, such as protective equipment needed to counter COVID-19. And this is a subject of my current research, is the illicit supply chains. And we see many of the counterfeit masks that we need to protect people from COVID coming and being shipped out of Hong Kong. And then I don't need to tell a Japanese audience that the Yamaguchi Gumi have had a base in Kobe, Japan. So in conclusion, urban environments are the economic centers of both the legitimate and the criminal economy. In some regions of the world, criminal groups assume a role in governance in urban areas, and this is far from a new phenomenon. As you can see here in this picture, this is an aid package being distributed during the pandemic in Guadalajara, a major northern Mexican city, the center of Mexican industry. And there's an image of El Chapo, who's head of one of the major crime groups in Mexico, who's now in prison in the United States, distributing relief aid from the crime group. As was mentioned by Dr. Hussain's introduction, climate change, conflict, and also great economic disparities between urban and rural areas foster rural to urban migration, and the recent migrants may be vulnerable to recruitment by crime groups. In some societies, participation in crime groups may be a form of social and economic mobility. And that's not just somewhere. Earlier in my career, my department chair always explained that her family got their first rung up the social ladder in organized crime. And recently, I had an email from a very prominent group of journalists telling me how many of them had families that were once involved in organized crime, but they went on to get educated and be great investigative journalists. So we are looking at a very complex phenomenon that is changing rapidly as large numbers of people are being displaced in the world, conflicts are not diminishing, and the challenges of climate change get ever greater. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Shelley, for this fascinating presentation. May I please request Nakamizo Sensei to begin his?
Yes, so firstly, I would like to thank Fujiwara Sensei for that kind introduction. And also, I would like to thank Nazia-san for inviting me this interesting workshop. Actually, the field of urban studies is a field which I wanted to explore, but haven't had its opportunity to do so. So this is, you see, the starting point of my exploration into the new field. So thank you very much for giving this precious opportunity. And today I want to talk on the COVID-19 crisis and COVID-19 and the migration crisis in India. So First, let me explain the purpose of this presentation and also the background of this presentation. So that purpose is to analyze the problems of urbanization, which are highlighted by the COVID-19 crisis in India by focusing on migration crisis. And so background is this. So Indian government made a sudden declaration of all India lockdown on 24th March of last year. It is just only 4 hours notice before the implementation. So this sudden declaration produced a huge wave of reverse migration. So this lockdown affected nearly 40 million internal migrants. Among them, around 10.4 million migrant laborers moved from urban areas to rural areas of origin in about 30 days from 1st of May to 31st May the last year. So it is said that this is the first major migration since the partition of British India in 1947. So let me briefly overview the urbanization in India. So according to official census, this is a gradual process, gradual urbanization. For example, 1991 is the starting point of economic liberalization. So the rate is 25.5%. And 2011 census is the latest census. The figure is 31.1. That means you see that the difference is just 6 that point. But we focus on the number of this internal migrant. So we can confirm the rapid increase. Actually, it's a figure triples since 1991, this economic liberalization. So that in 1991, the figure is 232 million, and 2020, this is estimate, so 6 million. So, and in this 6 million, so inter-migrant, it is estimated that so inter-district and interstate migrant is about around 200 million. So among 200 million, this 140 million are migrant workers. That means they are engaged in temporary and casual and informal employment. So government of India arranged Shramik trains. That Shramik means labor. Around that 4,100 train. So that from urban area to rural area. So most of the destinations are northern Indian state of Uttar Pradesh and Bihar. For example, Bihar is a topmost state. So train carried 2.36 million laborers and to UP 1.75 million. So this right, that figure shows the flow of interstate migration in mid-2010s. So the picture shows that before the pandemic, but we can observe the trend of interstate migration. As you see, this is the Uttar Pradesh and this is the Bihar, which I'm going to explain soon. So these are two major states which send migrant laborers to national capital of Delhi. So this is the flow of this interstate migration. So, and next is, let me explain this anti-COVID-19 measures in India. Firstly, at the initial stage, Indian government did not take so hard measures. For example, on March 12, this is next day of the declaration of pandemic by WHO, Indian Health Ministry stated that COVID-19 is not health emergency, so no need to panic. But after less than 2 weeks, this Narendra Modi-led central government made a sudden declaration, as I mentioned. So on 24th. So he said, this is the world's largest lockdown. So we will implement for 21 days. So after this 21 days, India could contain COVID-19 and in a complete way. But as that later development shows that his policy is invite total failure of containing this pandemic. So at this current stage, so our cumulative confirmed cases is more than 11 million. This position is third in the world, and confirmed this is 160,000. This position is fourth in the world. So now in India is in the middle of second wave. So this figure shows the strange index. So this gray, this line is India. So we can know how, you see, how suddenly this made this all India lockdown. So that means it's a jump from here to here. Yeah. So yes, this is the situation. And this policy invited a grave migration crisis. Actually, so Indian economy is characterized as a growth without employment. That means the dominance of informal sector. So it is estimated that 90% of workforce are in informal sector. So informal sector means with no minimum wages and also social security. For example, in Delhi, so more than 70% of the population of Delhi works in the unorganized sector, that means in informal sector. So after the declaration of lockdown, this panic spread among migrant laborers. So they lost their jobs and incomes and forms, and Modi government did not take any measures to help them. So they have to go back to their native places. So Narendra Modi admitted this point and just after the declaration of all India lockdown. So he stated, they, that means the poor, must be thinking, what kind of prime minister is this who has locked up all of us? I especially ask for forgiveness from them. So this right hand, this newspaper article is reporting the hardship that which migrant laborers are suffering. So this picture shows that migrant laborers' families are returning to their native village on foot because due to this all India lockdown, so no transportation is available. So they have to walk that from Delhi to their own villages. And this hard journey is this left, this article is reporting the bicycle girl who carried her injured father for 1,300 kilometers from Delhi to Bihar. And after receiving this news, Indian Cycling Federations offers her training for athletes, but she, this Jyoti, turned down this offer. And right picture shows the migrant laborers waiting for buses at Mumbai bus stand. It's a huge crowd, which you see becomes the cause of the spread of COVID-19. And if that they can get this transportation that from the city to rural areas, villages, so they have to face this kind of sanitization by the state government. And also the right picture shows the ceramic train. So it is, so government arranged that train, but the situation was very terrible. And so Modi government formally admitted that so 97 people died by traveling on this train. And this picture shows that the volunteers are providing that food and water to the passengers. This is the situation. This was the situation. And also many of migrants returned to their villages by using vehicle, but on road, 134 were killed by traffic accident by mid-May. So very hard journey. Then, so next I want to explain that the policies dealing with this migration crisis. So as I mentioned, this government arranged more than 4,000 ceramic trains, but this, how can I say, the reverse migration, so caused the spread of COVID-19. In case of Bihar, it is said that a quarter of migrant laborers are positive. And also government arranged food security, and so employment program, and so the rise of minimum wage, and also housing scheme, and so subsidies for employers for hiring new employees. But these policies are evaluated as insufficient and ineffective because of this crisis invite deep deprivation in rural areas like unemployment, poverty, and social unrest, and increasing debt, undernutrition, starvation, and suicide. This is not effective and insufficient. So that's next, but so I want to explore what is the political impact of this migrant crisis. So actually, so government policy failed to solve this problem. Then so what is the political impact on of this crisis? So I take up the case of 2020 Bihar State Assembly election, which was conducted in last October and November. So Bihar is one of the largest states which sends migrant laborers, which I just explained. And 2020 Bihar State Assembly election is the first major election after COVID-19 crisis. So the number of voters are more than 73 million. So it's a huge election. So in this election, employment is topmost important issue that from our survey and also in election campaign. And as a result, Narendra Modi-led BJP secured dominant position in the ruling coalition first time since independence, despite of the failure of anti-COVID-19 measures. Why it is so? So then, conditions of migrant laborers, I want to confirm from the evidence from our 2020 Bihar survey. This right hand slide explains the methodology for 2020 Bihar survey. So this survey was conducted as a two-panel survey and also its representative survey. So I am not explaining detail because shortage of time. But from this survey, we can say this many things in this left-hand slide. So we focused on agricultural laborers for investigating the migrant issue because most of the agricultural laborers are seasonal migrant laborers. So number of respondents is 193. So among respondents, 80% are seasonal migrant laborers as it is. And so among the seasonal migrant laborers, 45% worked out of Bihar. Among these seasonal migrant laborers who worked out of Bihar, 65% were out of Bihar at the time of all India lockdown. And 100% of them has to go back to Bihar, come back to Bihar. And so among them, 54% used bus, 22% used train, blah, 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 and 2% used bicycle, and 2% walked to home. And so among the seasonal migrant laborers, 86% experienced a decrease of their income. 23% lost their jobs, and 65% did not lose jobs, but their work was reduced since COVID-19 crisis. So among the seasonal migrant laborers, 20% received financial support from Bihar state government, while 76% received none 1 month before the election. So then what is the voting behaviors of these migrant laborers? And our data shows the strong support for policies despite hardship which they experience. Actually, I cannot believe these things, but our data shows this. I picked up 3 issues: anti-COVID-19 measures by central government and Modi's policy, and Nitish's policy. Nitish is the head of state government. So first point is we actually asked, how satisfied are you with the steps taken by the central government in preventing the spread of the COVID-19 in India? So 76% replied positively. And Modi's policy, how do you evaluate? So that 64% replied positively, yes. So I trust that Modi's policy. And also state government is 60%. I cannot believe this, but this data is showing this trend. And also this right-hand figure is party support. So actually, among migrant laborers, more laborers support for ruling coalition. This BJP, Bharatiya Janata Party, and JDU is a ruling coalition. In total, this is 35%. And this Indian National Congress and Rashtriya Janata Dal is opposition. In the total is 31%. So margin is not so big, just 4%, but still this more laborers support for ruling coalition. So let me conclude that my presentation, so agendas for future studies. There are 3 points. The first point is that why did migrant laborers support for ruling coalition despite of hardships? This is very difficult to answer because actually, so I cannot understand. But the one clue to understand their political behavior is that the concept of political visuals, which was proposed by Series2. So he said the extraordinary level of support of Modi and BJP was because voters expected a delivery from Modi in the future and were not judging him based on what he had actually delivered over the previous 5 years. So yes, this political visuals is pervasive, but still, you see, I cannot believe instantly. Actually, this is the limit of the sample survey. So I have to do more field work to explore this point, but a situation is not allowing me to do so because I cannot enter to India due to this pandemic. And for regarding to this political visuals, I personally think this concept is pervasive, but at the same time, it is one-sided because I think the Modi policy has 2 dimensions. One is reward and another is punishment. So this politics visuals emphasize only reward side. So I propose the concept of political obedience as a Modi's politics. So, but this is not directly related to the issue of urban studies. So I am not developing this point further. So if you are interested in, please look at my forthcoming article, which is listed in the references. So this is the first point. Second point is longing for strong leadership. So we asked if Modi is not PM, would you have voted for some other party instead of BJP, NDA, this ruling coalition? So 43% of BJP voters replied yes, and 33% for migrant laborers, migrant laborers, BJP voters. This is a huge percentage actually, and so this shows the desire for strong leadership. That means Modi is emphasizing the strong leadership always. So this issue could, you see, it can be related to the rising tide of populism worldwide, and also can be connected to the crisis of democracy. So this migration issue also highlights this question. This is the second point. And the last point is directly related to the urban studies. Actually, for thinking about the migrant workers, actually it is so de facto exclusion of migrant workers from democratic process. That means for migrant workers, it is quite difficult to return to their native place for casting their vote. And as I explained to you, now in India, this interstate migrant laborers is increasing, rapidly increasing. And that means a large number of people cannot cast their vote. Of course, it is not legally prohibited, of course, in the still democratic country, but actually they cannot go because of their working condition. So this this would create this very big problem for the future of Indian democracy. And so urban studies need to think about this point. So how to deal with this problem. So this is my third point. So let me finish my presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Nakamizo Sensei, for this very important presentation. Now invite Professor Yui Zhang, and just a shout out to the audience. If you have any questions, please type them in the Q&A chat. Thank you.